Welcome to Ampersand, the podcast helping good people be heard and comms people be better. Hey, Ry, thanks for joining.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
It's good to see your face. Do you want to do a quick intro?
Sure. My name's Ry Moran. I am Métis, Red River Métis. I'm living in Lekwungen territory, which is on the west side of Canada in what's also known as Victoria. I work at the University of Victoria. I've been here for about 4.5 years. I'm the Associate University Librarian Reconciliation, and have had the really huge honor and privilege of doing a lot of work on truth and reconciliation over the last 15 plus years now.
Yeah, which is how we know each other. So I'm very happy that you're taking the time to talk to me today. So we always start with an icebreaker. It definitely will sort of give us your age, but can you share a memory from your first computer or early days on the internet?
Well, I was thinking about this. So certainly I'm of the generation where it was really pre-internet, I guess, and in a way pre-computer. But one little point in time marker that I'd like to situate technology around is actually relates to the TRC. When we started with the TRC, iPhones were still relatively new, but iPads themselves were not available with cameras in Canada. And if we think about like just the evolution of tablets and how ingrained in our society and how ubiquitous they've come and actually how handy they are, it's sort of interesting to think about the passage of time and where we were then and where we are now, just by virtue of that one little marker, like the presence of tablets. Think about what that even does societally, so it's.
Yeah, 100%. It's changed everything, as it were. So I want to take a little bit of time and ask you to reflect on your personal experiences through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which obviously you worked on for the commission's length. What stands out as sort of one of the most impactful moments?
Yeah, there's so many different impactful moments, of course, as you go along that journey. I think in some ways, some of the things that are not often talked about, but stand out very clearly in my mind, relate to the size of the team and actually, in many ways, how small the team was. There were a number of meetings that I was in at the TRC where, it would be the commissioners and the limited number of, senior staff that we had at the TRC around our board table in the Winnipeg offices, wrestling with really, really, really hard issues, like complex strategic, operational issues, things that were huge forks in the road for the TRC that ultimately related directly back to whether or not the TRC would succeed or fail in its mandate. And in many of those cases, you could just feel the weight of the decisions that were being made in the room and the heaviness of responsibility that was especially on the shoulders of the commissioners as we sort of tackled some of these really, really tough challenges. And they were made particularly weighty by the incredible importance of the work that everybody so clearly understood. And when it actually comes down to, marrying that sort of weight of responsibility within the service to survivors, to Indigenous peoples, and really to the country as a whole, then some of the most important elements, unquestioningly, were just how clearly, how eloquently, how forcefully, how strong the survivors spoke throughout all of the hearings and all of the work that the TRC did, how much courage and determination they had in standing up in front of audiences or being behind closed doors in sharing their truths. Sometimes begging, sometimes pleading, oftentimes demanding that Canadians pay attention and listen to what they were saying, because this truth that was surfaced through the TRC really matters, and it continues to matter just as much today as it did at the moment that it was shared.
Yeah, and I think, those stories were hard to share and so important to share. And I think to a certain extent, it has moved the country forward. But, you look at the calls to action, and they're not, I don't think anyone assumed they'd be done in 10 years, but, are there specific areas that you think should be addressed more immediately? Like what's urgent?
Well, I think, the theory, on human rights type stuff and human rights calls is that they're all important, they're all interrelated, and they're all interdependent. So as we sort of move forward through time, there's really all of the calls to action are important at the same time. Now, realistically, can they all be implemented at the same time? Not necessarily. The commission itself plays very clear importance on child welfare right at the outset of the calls to action. That's where the very first calls to action related to keeping kids safe and improving lives and outcomes for children today as the first and most important calls to action. And on that, we have seen some movement. We've seen new legislation, of course. We've seen nations start to draw down authority on a self-determining and self-governing basis to care for their kids. We've seen more robust implementation of Jordan's principle, and there's also a ton more work to do there. As we go, I think also on education, education, there has been a lot of movement. There is, we always have to remember that when we started at the TRC, 2010, this is 15 years ago, residential schools were not in any curricula really formally across the country. And since that point, these are, core learning outcomes and core curricular activities. So that is positive. We are seeing, kids graduating from high school now for many, many years, graduating at least with understanding and knowledge that residential schools existed. They've heard survivor stories. They're much more grounded in the some of the challenges that Indigenous peoples have been forced to endure. And remembering broadly too, just as a little refresher for folks that are watching this, the TRC's calls to action are really divided into two chunks in many ways. There's the things that need to be done immediately to address the harm and to prevent further harm from occurring. And then there's the big ticket reconciliation stuff that comes in the latter half of the calls to action. Sitting right there in the middle, of course, are very important sort of hinge calls to action, calls such as the National Council for Reconciliation. Now, we've just seen that start to emerge. There's an initial board that has been appointed. We're 10 years out. Really, that board should have been in place toot sweet. Frankly, the former prime minister had committed to seeing that council achieved as one of the core promises that were made a year out from the release of the TRC's calls to action. Right beside that, there's other important calls. Calls that former chair Murray Sinclair talked about. The importance of a new royal proclamation or a covenant on reconciliation, things that were intended to fundamentally reset the relationship. And we haven't really seen that much happen on those. And I suppose lastly, the good news though, perhaps is I'm here at the University of Victoria. Largely in response to the TRC's calls to action, but thanks to the huge amount of work that's been done by scholars like Val Napoleon and John Burroughs here. We have, the National Center for Indigenous Laws here at the University of Victoria. And we're seeing graduates now leaving the University of Victoria with a joint degree in, common law and Canadian law and Indigenous legal orders. And the importance of that really cannot be understated. It is of vital and critical importance that we see Indigenous legal orders become part of the active fabric of law and legal precedents in this country. And that is a really critical tool in the toolkit that's going to help the country as a whole be able to better grapple with a number of the challenges that it's going to continue to face in the number of years and decades to come, frankly.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, as you know, our favorite Murray Sinclair Iban used to always said, education is key. So I think, your first point around education has always resonated, especially with me because of, my parents are both academics.
Mm-hmm.
We've come a long way, but obviously there's still a long way to go. Speaking of which, in recent years, we've seen this rising, resurgence or rise of denialism about residential schools. It's gross. It's obviously totally inappropriate, but are there strategies that you would recommend from a communications and truth-telling point of view in terms of how folks should be pushing back?
Yeah, definitely. So first of all, I think, if folks are tuning in and thinking about how to stay on guard against denialist, the movement really is, first of all, be very, very cautious in and engage critically in your sources and fact check your sources. Understand what you're reading and where it's coming from. Because one of the things that the denialist or anti-truth or diminishment movement that is unfolding in the country is that they're very good at cloaking themselves and hiding themselves and confusing readers, actually. For example, there is a website that's been created, and I forget the exact name of it off the top of my head, but it's Indian residential schools history, and at first glance, it might appear that it is an authoritative site on residential schools history, but in fact, it is very chock full with content that is intentionally aimed at, exercising those kind of, the D's of denialism. So deflect and diminishment and denial, of course. And what that requires of readers that are trying to get more information on residential schools is to just engage cautiously and to engage critically in the information that you are being presented with. And right now, I mean, sometimes that's happening and other times it's not. And I think one of the most, there's the people out there that are naturally going to gravitate towards sort of denialist or diminishment ideals because they don't want to believe that what has happened in Canada is indeed as bad as it is. The belief that Canada has been a bastion for human rights is a very deeply entrenched value. It's a very deeply entrenched ideal that we have held as a country, and disrupting that, of course, comes with a great deal of discomfort. And some people can handle that discomfort better than others, I think. And that desire to cling on to the idea that everything's fine and dandy in Canada and it wasn't that bad is a very, very powerful narrative. And that's the type of narrative that a lot of the denialist movement feeds right into. So, in summary, check your sources, be conscious, be aware of where the information is coming from and what goal that information has. Ultimately, at the end of the day, we should be able to measure this broad work of truth and reconciliation against, some very lofty and important ideals. Does this advance human rights in Canada? Does this advance greater the achievement of respectful relationships between Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples? Does this advance, a more peaceful and harmonious society? These are the big goals. This is the hard work that we're trying to work through as a country. And unfortunately, I think a lot of the information that's out there is from this sort of denialist movement is holding us back from being able to really lean heavily into the human rights and respectful relationships conversation, because it's fundamentally based on the denial of somebody else's truth. And when you deny somebody else's truth, that's a pretty grim starting point for respectful relationships.
Yeah, and I mean, we spend lots of time at MDash on the internet, and one of the things that our clients and partners have been worried about, we did a survey last summer, and they were talking about how the rise of misinformation and disinformation on the internet is just it's out of control. So it kind of speaks to the importance of when you do comms and when you do this work in the world, like making sure that your organization's reputation and relationships are like solid. I mean, you used to work with the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation, and so did we, and we're longtime supporters, and like the work that they're doing to push back is important, but they're also, that is the source that people should be going to, right? Like that's the archives of the TRC.
Well, that's right. Is like, there are authoritative records that are extremely well researched, that are reliable and are authentic. So if you want to learn about residential schools, for certain, go to the TRC's work, go to the primary source materials, look at the documents for yourself, understand really what's going on. Read survivor accounts too. If you want to know what was happening in the schools, the survivors are unquestioningly the experts on what was happening in the schools. And thankfully, there has been a real flourishing of those truths emerging over the last 15, 20 years. And we're now fortunate to have some really high quality and a lot of different survivor accounts that have been written. So that's, if you want to know what the perspectives and experiences of Indigenous people are, which are really the people that we need to be listening to when it comes to residential schools, read the Indigenous sources, or read the sources that have made a very, very intentional effort of centering those experiences and those truths in the material. Materials that start off with the assertion or assumption that somebody's lying and that, we're trying to pull the wool over people's eyes in Canada around, human rights violations, is a very, very dubious source. And of course, then it really, when we see that type of content, we really have to ask ourselves, well, who's going to benefit from this information? And is it actually going to help propel us towards a more respectful future or not? Is it going to hold us back? And so much of this is holding us back, actually, from a respectful relationship.
So one of the things that is near and dear to your heart is music and creative composition. How First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people telling their own stories and publishing and, writing music. How does that contribute to reconciliation efforts? And have you written the song you told me you were going to write?
I'm heavy on the writing. I'm short on the releasing right now. So that's kind of my problem. I don't know. It's a little bit of it's this odd dance that I've been doing for the last number of years, trying to figure out how to recenter my music work in my life again. But lots of writing.
It's all the hats that you have to wear.
It is. But what I've been learning about more and what I've been appreciating more are the interrelationships between culture, all manifestations of culture, and the relationship of that to thrivance and wellness, and to broad and important and lofty goals of human rights and human dignity, and the corresponding attacks on culture. And what I mean by all of this is that, if we rewind the clock back to just shy of 10 years ago, early June, we heard, Marie Sinclair, Yvonne stand up and say what happened in the residential schools was cultural genocide. And since then, that has been, expanded further by the National Inquiry to say that it was genocide. And we've since seen all parliamentarians agree on that fact. And certainly there's been a ton of evidence to support that. And Canadians are starting to understand that what's happened is indeed genocide. But returning to that statement that the TRC made on genocide and cultural genocide, where the contemporary literature is right now in big human rights thinking is that, attacks on culture are very much, equal to all other forms of genocide, because when you attack culture, what you are doing is trying to destroy the very essence of life itself, the things that make life rich, that the knowledge, the practices, the attributes, the stuff, the materiality of life that is held and transmitted to future generations. And we know this because, there's really important groups in this country like the Indigenous Heritage Circle that have said, well, what is cultural heritage? What is cultural heritage from the perspective of Indigenous peoples? And they say, well, cultural heritage itself is defined as the stuff that gives meaning to life. Right? So when we rewind the clock and we think about the things that were removed through residential schools, we're seeing all of the things that give meaning to life: language, the practice, the style, fashion, music, governance, laws, legal orders. Those are all the things that give meaning to life. So if we know that there was an attempt to destroy, then what's the response to that? Well, thrivance, survivance, expression, cultural celebration, cultural sharing, cultural, again, thrivance, like I've already said. And that's where, the arts and culture and language are so critically important, and food, all of these things that combine to make life rich, and then make life rich also in a way that really lends itself to sharing and to sharing with others, right? And when we take a big step back, too, we understand that, like, when it comes to cultural heritage, and we look at this either through UNESCO or, United Nations principles, or other through the broad principle of human rights, we can understand that any attack on any culture really around the world, something that makes cultures less vibrant rather than, bright and multiplicitous, is an attack on humanity itself. So our work of achieving respectful relationships and our work of making better futures in the society is fundamentally rooted in the resurgence of all aspects of Indigenous culture, and a resurgence in a way that allows others to see and to learn from, and to be part of the celebration of the existence of that culture. So I don't know, that's like a long and rattling, winding way of just saying that, like, arts and culture matter not just because they're awesome, but because they relate to the very essence of what it means to be human and what it means to be a people's. And when we share people's cultures and attributes, and when we do that in ways that allow us to, like, learn from one another, then we really get to understand the incredible richness and all the gifts that all the peoples of the world bring. And that naturally leads us to wanting to protect and preserve diversity. It leads us to naturally wanting to ensure that all people's rights are protected, to ensure that all those cultural practices continue to exist through time, and also be given the freedom to morph and adapt and be all of the rich and vibrant things that cultures actually are.
That was a very thorough answer. Thank you.
Very thorough. I feel like,
tell that you care about that deeply.
yeah. Well, and it's like, how does music relate to that? It's all good.
Well, and I mean,
Yeah.
you know, in any of the things, like I remember the TRC, it was really important that there was cultural aspects in everything that was done. And you know, you guys, I think I heard some pretty funny stories about what happened after the story gathering, and you know, with the like talent shows and like, you know, like a way to find joy and also celebrate, you know, amongst the survivors and the TRC team. Just switching gears a bit. I mean, you're at UVic now, and before that you were at UManitoba. What progress have you seen from where you sit in terms of how Indigenous perspectives are being integrated into higher ed, and you know, what gaps remain to be sort of sorted out?
Yeah. So I think there's been a lot of change, and there's still a long ways to go, like all things. I mean, post-secondary institutions are big systems unto themselves. They are big bureaucracies, you know. So there is, I think, a very, very clear and undeniable history of excellent work being done at the level of, you know, professors and students and that. And there's exceptional programs that we've seen existing in Canada for really a long time, and University of Manitoba, UVic, you know, Trent. I mean, lots of different institutions. I mean, that's just naming just a handful, just off the top of my head, have done exceptional work over the years. Structurally, I think universities are gathering steam or you know, making some important changes. So certainly when we look holistically at the sector, it's gone from being a rarity for there to be senior Indigenous peoples in, you know, vice president or associate vice president roles, to now being more common, if not common. There is still, you know, not uniformity across that, across the country, but we're certainly seeing most post-secondary institutions appreciate that they need Indigenous peoples in senior decision-making roles. That oftentimes has been centrally first. What's happening, for example, at the University of Victoria is we're seeing that now rolled out across other faculties as well. So we're seeing, you know, senior Indigenous peoples put in at you know, that just beside the sort of the dean level, so at the vice dean level. And that's intended to ensure that, you know, our senior Indigenous leaders aren't just there as an office of one or two trying to, you know, manage or address change in an institution that has very deep, long, and like concretized roots. You know, these systems are meant to be stable for a reason, and that means that they don't like to change for a reason too, because they're, you know, it's the way they are. So you know, that understanding or that recognition that it's not just one or two voices around the table, but an entire structure and system of change, of course, is really important. And then I think that'll continue to happen at other institutions as well. You know, the other big thing, and I mean, it's just the unfortunate reality of the world that we live in too, is all of the work that's happening on Indigenous identity inside of post-secondary institutions. And that's something that, you know, has been a necessary and sort of painful journey from sort of self-identification to where we are now. And by virtue of some of the messiness or the ugliness even that's happened over the last little while, that is where we see post-secondary institutions now needing to put policies in place to ensure that those that are saying they're Indigenous are indeed Indigenous, and that if there are set-aside positions for those folks, that they're actually meeting the criteria. And that's happening not only at the university level, but also at the level of the tri-council agencies. And this is all a work in progress. It's all sort of being fleshed out. But, that is a major, responsibility and evolution for post-secondary institutions, because ultimately, at the end of the day, all of this is meant to try to move us towards Indigenous peoples having, agency and ownership over Indigenous affairs within, institutions. And in so doing, we need to make sure that, the folks that are actually, doing that are actually Indigenous. And that's not, a small piece of work, but a very, very important change that's developed, largely just in response to truth, right? The truth aspect of truth and reconciliation.
Yeah, and it's a complex one, depending on who you speak to and how you divide. Yeah, all of probably the Canadian government's making of the issue in the first place. So, or maybe not all, but mostly. So, I mean, all of it's very challenging.
Yeah.
So I have one last quick question. We're 10 years in. What do you think the next 10 will look like?
Well, I'm not certain, to tell you the truth. And the reason for that is, I think what I'm going to be watching for in the next, say, 12 months is whether or not, or at least our federal government, at least, takes steps towards substantive ongoing work on reconciliation. We didn't hear much at all about Indigenous peoples or Indigenous matters or topics or reconciliation in this last election cycle. And, the pressures right now that are on Canada to, defend its sovereignty, interestingly, parallel so closely to the work that Indigenous peoples have been doing to protect their sovereignty. But, right now, the idea of, be it separation in Alberta or ramming pipelines through in defense of the national interest, are forgetting some very, very fundamental truths. Treaties, UNDRIP, free, prior, and informed consent, longstanding relationships. So, if we are a country that has been walking on this sort of complicated, lurching path towards, a better and a more improved, respectful relationship with Indigenous peoples. And I think, the next little while is going to be a really significant test to how much, reconciliation is actually seen as being a structural imperative rather than just nice words on a page and, a few lovely statements, because that's always the worry, right? It's always the worry. But when we start thinking about the national interest and, the future of this country, it has to include Indigenous peoples, because there's only one of two outcomes that can come out of that. Either the relationship worsens. We see, again, just the use of courts as being the only mechanism to resolve conflicts or disputes, which isn't actually in the best interest of anybody. We're better around tables, working together with the presence of rights being there. Or, it can just really fracture or break down or reduce a lot of the some of the goodwill that's been created over the years. So I don't know. These are very, very complicated times that we're living in right now. And the radar sensor that I'm, attuned to right now is just how are Indigenous peoples being centered in the conversation. Our national interest, Canada's national interest, has to involve Indigenous voices, full stop, period. Just for the structural realities of the Constitution, if nothing else, right? And we got to lean into this, and that's important moving forward.
Well, that's it for this week's episode of Ampersand. Thanks for joining us. For more comms and design tips, sign up for our newsletter at m-agency.ca and follow us on your favorite podcasting app so that you don't miss our next episode. Ampersand is hosted by Meghana Ramaswamy and me, Caitlin Keeley, and it's produced by Elio Peterson. This podcast is a project of M-, the small agency focused on big impact helping progressives be heard.